Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, foreign policy, and international relations. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. In this episode, we'll discuss the impact of and challenges posed by the 2023 Canadian wildfire season on our national security and how we can mitigate the effects of and become more resilient to increasingly severe wildfires. This cross-disciplinary panel explores the impact of increasingly severe wildfires from CAF in intergovernmental, fire ecology, climate science, forest management, and indigenous perspectives. We're also going to dive into the ramifications of establishing a national firefighting force, the role of the Canadian Armed Forces, complexities of federal-provincial cooperation, empowering indigenous leadership through cultural burns, proactive mitigation and resilient efforts, altering wildfire behavior via landscape management, and a national firefighting strategy to address escalating wildfires in Canada. This is the Expert Series. Thanks for tuning in. In the first part of today's episode, we'll be speaking with the Honourable Andrew Leslie and then Peter Kasarak to discuss the impact of ongoing wildfires in Northwest Territories and BC on the CAF, the role of the CAF in disaster management, and the challenges of federal-provincial cooperation when it comes to addressing natural disasters, and in particular wildfires. First up, the Honourable Andrew Leslie. Andrew, thanks for joining me today. To kick things off, to what extent does the allocation of resources and attention to combating wildfires in Canada, particularly in Northwest Territories and BC, divert crucial resources and impact the preparedness and operational capabilities of the CAF for other national security challenges?
Well, for a government that has trumpeted its environmental awareness and climate change responsiveness, the Liberal government has done almost nothing to actually contribute to means of trying to mitigate the dramatic impact that environmental warming is having on the quality of life and the safety of Canadians. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, instead of having a dedicated emergency response organization that actually has some teeth, in other words, some people and equipment to respond in cooperation with the provinces, their default position is to go to the Canadian forces and dispatch them to assist with a variety of relatively mundane tasks, important nonetheless, but is it a task that the Canadian forces should be doing or has the resources to do so? All right, so let me answer the first question. Should it be doing that? Yes, if there's no one else available. And that's the current circumstance. Why? Because the federal government hasn't invested any resources or any thinking actually into creating specific emergency response organizations who have the funding and the appropriate equipment at the national level. Instead, they prefer to watch the provinces struggle to deal with it, and they step in with the Canadian forces, thereby getting the credit for sending the troops. And by the way, having the troops respond to natural disasters is very comforting to the local population because they get a sense of safety and security and a sense of relief that finally someone has showed up to give them a hand. So before I go any further, as a soldier, I've been involved in floods, ice storms, forest fires, searching for lost children, prison riots, assistance to the civil power and civil authorities, and the list goes on. A fairly typical response for a 35-year career. I've also worked at the provincial level as a region or an area commander was called in those days, where you're actively helping and advising the premiers and the legal authorities as to what capacity the armed forces might have in certain specific regions and how one should respond. To answer the question directly, this is a diversion of crucial resources at a time when the Canadian Armed Forces should be focused like a laser beam on addressing the 16,000 person shortfall in their ranks. And let's not forget what happens over there overseas can and does have an impact in Canada. We've got the Ukraine war raging. We've got Russia's ambitions, certainly not limited to Ukraine. We've got increasing tension with China. Africa is crying out for help, where hundreds of thousands are dying every week in terms of climate disasters, warlords, wars. And Canada has 25 peacekeepers overseas because that's the only capacity we can provide. That's 25, that's half a school bus.
What lessons have you learned through your involvement in various natural disaster relief efforts? And do you think any of these lessons can be applied or have been applied to enhance the overall operational readiness and agility of the CAF?
Yeah, so first of all, as a caveat, the provinces and territories have emergency response cells that actually do good work. They're very good at coordinating. A lot of them are ex-military, but not all. And the experience level within them is excellent in some cases, and in others it needs to be beefed up and they need more resources. At the provincial level, the machineries of government are well attuned to the process to go about asking for assistance. Likewise, the various military folk involved at provincial and federal level are extraordinarily good at seeing what the art of the possible is and what can and should be done. I would say my experience in terms of response to natural disasters is fairly typical, as I've mentioned, for a senior armed forces officer of 35 years experience. What is not typical is the rapidity of the natural disasters that climate change is causing in and within Canada. And something has to change because the circumstances have changed. So relying on the armed forces to respond to natural disasters is a stopgap measure because it takes them away from other stuff, which is increasingly important because the world is becoming a more dangerous place. And Canada has to be prepared to respond to protect our sovereignty, and cooperation with international friends and allies contribute to international peace and security. So what is needed is an organization that has the resources and the capacity and the capabilities to assist in provincial response, and where necessary to be directed by the federal government to actually go with their water bombers or crews to fight forest fires or experts to help shore up floods at the drop of a hat, which implies a full-time and part-time organization. That has not happened, and nor is there any thinking about it at the federal level.
How would we go about developing a national response unit to address wildfires and natural disasters, and what would that look like?
Well, all we can do, actually, there's many things we can do, but in the short term, all we can do is take a good look at the extraordinarily good examples that some of our best friends and allies have done. Be it Japan, be it Germany, be it France, and the list goes on. So this is not a new idea, but it's certainly a new idea to Canada because we've always been relatively secure in the knowledge that we had lots of space, and if there was forest fires burning, most of them weren't big and raging under control to the extent they are now. We're getting increasingly concerned about the carbon footprint, of course, that forest fires produce, which is staggering amounts. And as well, we've got to do more to mitigate against the extraordinary temperatures that the nation is facing. And that has an impact on both, obviously, for floods, for the winter, for ice storms, for forest fires. And we're now seeing the direct result of this inability to see beyond their own navels and the lack of an emergency response organization, because we've got major towns and provincial capitals or territorial capitals being evacuated because there are insufficient resources to keep the dangers at bay. Really, it's all gets down to leadership. Leadership in the Prime Minister's office, leadership in the Finance Minister's office, it sort of stops there. The buck stops there. Nothing has happened to address this issue. Nothing has happened to plan for tomorrow when a whole bunch of yesterdays have shown the demand. So it's quite frustrating. Must be frustrating to Canadians. Must be frustrating to those people who've lost their homes. Yeah, the whole idea of an emergency response unit is not new. A variety of proposals have been submitted to the federal government over the last several years. It's been nothing but crickets chirping in the dark in terms of a response. There's a variety of options as how to organize it. Is it within the Canadian Forces? Is it an adjunct to the Canadian Forces? Is it a standalone organization? My recommendation would be, in terms of the command and control and response required, an adjunct, in other words, a build-on to the Canadian Forces. It could be done quickly. It's going to be remarkably efficient. It'll be well utilized. a federal government's first responsibility, which sometimes they forget, is the safety and security of Canadians. So we have threats overseas, and we've got threats at home. So in the case of the Cold War of days gone by, it's getting a lot warmer and hotter with Russia and China and others. And by the way, the Cold War never existed at home per se, but it's certainly getting a lot hotter. And in both cases, internationally and domestically, the federal government, to my mind, is failing in its ultimate responsibilities to do that which it can to mitigate the dangers and risks to Canadians. So it's time for a change.
Thanks for joining us today, Mr. Leslie. I appreciate your insights. Next, we'll turn to Peter Kasarak, former Senior Principal for National Security in the Office of the Auditor General. Peter, thanks so much for joining me. Let's dive right in, shall we? I posed this question to Mr. Andrew Leslie, and I'll pose it to you as well. To what extent does the allocation of resources and attention to combating wildfires in Canada divert crucial resources and impact the preparedness and operational capabilities of the CAF for other national security challenges?
Well, it's actually fairly difficult to say, but my overall impression is that it's not much. When you look at the 30 some odd call outs for humanitarian and disaster relief incidents since 2010, most of them are pretty small in terms of their draw on forces resources. There are only 3 that called for more than 2,000 troops, which are the Eastern Canada floods in 2019 and the Southern Alberta floods in 2013. So they're also fairly short duration. Most of them are less than 2 weeks. So those sorts of incidents really, they're disruptive, but they should not affect readiness very much. Now, there are some outliers that are important. The Red River floods of 1997 required 8,000 personnel to be deployed, and the ice storm in 1998 required 12,000 personnel to be deployed. So those are obviously huge impacts. And also during the COVID pandemic, while probably overall the forces were not affected by the humanitarian disaster relief deployments, the medical service certainly was, and they were not structured to provide that level of service, and they were really consumed by the pandemic. So you can have specialist resources that are hugely affected, but the CAF overall, not so much. Assuming that the policy remains the same, and Strong, Secure, Engage says that humanitarian disaster relief is one of the priority tasks of the forces, they really need to do more than treat it as an other related duty. I mean, there needs to be, the only dedicated portion of the regular force is the DART team, which is a company size force. So that's really pretty modest. And sort of the other response has been to turn this into a reserve task, which I think is sort of just shoving it off again. So if the forces want to, if by policy they are required to stay in the game, they should then organize themselves to do so, and that means some considerable regular force involvement as well as the reserves.
Should the government consider establishing a dedicated federal agency specifically designed to handle HADR missions, or should the CAF remain the primary responder? And what are the potential advantages and challenges of each approach?
Well, the short answer is the task has not been well enough defined for anybody to say for sure who should be at the center of it. Certainly, the CAF is not going to be able to back all the way out. For the really big disasters like Red River flood and ice storm, the demand for just labor is going to be so high that they're going to be involved. Also, when you look at the 30 some odd incidents the last 20 years, aviation has played a big role in that. And there is not going to be a civilian air force to support humanitarian and disaster relief. It's going to be the RCAF is going to have that job. So the CAF is not going to be able to back out completely. But until the actual job is better defined, what sort of civilian agency would be better is hard to say. The government has tried to take the low-cost option of encouraging NGOs to build more capacity. It's hard to say how successful this has been. It's been somewhat successful. They're putting more money in it. They're putting $80 million a year into it. But when you compare the current effort at trying to support volunteer resources with what is done elsewhere, like the German Technische Hilfswerk is often cited. That's an 80,000 person volunteer organization with a budget of $1 billion a year. And the Australian state emergency service organizations, New South Wales is 20,000 volunteers and about $150 million a year to support that. So we're talking about orders of magnitude larger, even if we're talking about a federally sponsored volunteer organization, much less something that would be a permanent freestanding federal organization.
How can the Canadian government enhance its whole of government approach to disaster management and ensure the effective coordination between different departments and agencies and optimize the resources of the CAF for situations that require such unique capabilities?
Well, I mean, I think the federal government has recognized that it would like to move the whole federal involvement from recovery and paying for disasters after the fact to mitigation. The Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangements program recently had an expert panel look at this, and they came up with a bunch of recommendations. But in essence, they wanted to prioritize what is actually required in terms of resilience measures and to move federal funding from recovery to mitigation. But to do that, I mean, it's not only multi-jurisdictional, but they suggested it was multi-sector as well, that the private sector would have to be more involved than currently. So yeah, there's a lot that can be done in terms of trying to move things into mitigation to try to reduce what's going to be required in terms of disaster relief. But I mean, we're still at the let's get together and talk stage, like to try to get any actual facts on what the actual requirement is and what the resources required would be at this stage is very difficult. I mean, from somebody that's sort of outside the government sector, it's really hard to say what the best solution is, although the general direction is clear.
How would you assess the provincial responses to ongoing wildfires? And does the federal government need to work on perhaps incentivizing the provinces to invest more in their own emergency response capabilities?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the federal government obviously sees that's what it would like to do, but there doesn't seem to be a lot being produced other than talk and reports. I mean, the federal government has made a number of initiatives over the last 10 years to try to get the provinces together to work on this. But when you look at the reports that have been produced, it's all, we need to develop a better plan. So what the federal government can do in addition, to me, is really not clear. I mean, there are genuine jurisdictional issues. The problem really is owned by the provinces, and given the state of federal-provincial relations, I'm not sure the feds can really go much farther than they actually have. I mean, there is a problem now with the sort of paying after the fact, and it creates an obvious moral hazard in terms of it's easy for municipalities and provinces to not take unpopular measures like preventing building on floodplains or moving people off floodplains, and they say, well, the feds will pay for it in the end anyway. So, I mean, that could be looked at to try to tighten the tap, but it's obviously a political problem for the federal government to do that.
Any final thoughts, Mr. Kasarek?
I guess my final thought is really, as far as the armed forces go, is that it really is time for them to consider this a priority task. I mean, the public at large is always going to expect the CAF to be there, and unless that is taken seriously by senior leadership, there isn't going to be a lot of change on this file.
Thanks for joining me, Peter. Pleasure having you on. Having covered the CAF and governmental perspectives, we're going to spend the rest of this episode on traditional Indigenous fire stewardship, the science of increasing wildfires, mitigation and resilience efforts, as well as forest management and fire ecology. Up next, we have Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen, and reading from her bio, Amy is a Métis woman from Treaty 8 territory, currently living in Treaty 6, as well as a research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service, Natural Resources Canada. Thanks for joining us today, Amy. Really appreciate it. I'm wondering if to start off, you could provide a bit of a backgrounder on cultural burnings for those who aren't aware of the practice.
So Indigenous people used to use fire on the landscape all across Canada, but I think it's important to point out that it wasn't like a pan-Indigenous practice. Like some Indigenous nations didn't use fires, others used it in different ways and for different reasons. But I think the thing that they found was that, by watching lightning and natural fire's relationship with the land, was that there could be good outcomes from fire. And if they controlled kind of when and where they burned, they were able to kind of change the effects of what fire would do on the landscape. So by burning at certain times of the year, when the risk was lower, when the fire intensity was lower, they could basically produce cultural outcomes that they wanted on the land. And one of the benefits of that was that they primarily burned to achieve cultural things, right? Like improving berry picking, having medicinal plants grow closer to their settlements, making it easier to hunt. But another side benefit was that by using fire on the land, it reduced the amount of vegetation that was there to burn when these kind of bad fire events occurred. So bad fires are like, in the summer, when it's hot, when it's dry, when it's windy, and when we can't control fire.
I'm wondering if you might be able to touch on what factors led to the criminalization of cultural burning practices among different Indigenous communities, and what impact this has had on both Indigenous nations that employ these practices, but also on the frequency and severity of wildfires, if any.
So when settlers first came to Canada, they were impressed by obviously our forests and the amount of, quote unquote, natural resources that were out there for harvesting. And one of those things was the timber supply, right? The amount of trees that were there, especially in the boreal forest. But they saw these big fires happening and were scared, right? Because they brought with them these European perspectives of fire, that it was meant to be controlled. And they definitely didn't understand the relationship that Indigenous people had with the land. And that comes from just a lot of, embedded racism and white supremacist thought, I guess, to be quite blunt about it. So when they came over, they brought with them these fire exclusion policies. And so immediately they started trying to reduce the amount of fire that was on the land. And so first that was just with stopping people from using fire, but then eventually it turned into what we see now with fire suppression, or, where we go and put out fires that happen on the land. And so for Indigenous peoples, what that did was it basically broke their relationship with fire in many places. And so for many nations in the east of Canada, so-called Canada, they used fire. But now because the history of colonization is so long there, they definitely don't have as close of an understanding of how to use fire, when to use fire anymore, because they've just been excluded from that, being on their territory and doing that. In like northern Canada, there's been much, less disruption there, although, I mean, obvious disruption, but a less longer history of colonization. So for many people up here, like our grandparents burned because, it was a very vast and difficult area to patrol. So the relationship hasn't been severed as long. But I would say with, those fire exclusion policies that came into place, and then plus residential school systems, putting people through the Indian Act onto reserves, not letting people leave unless they had a pass. All of that obviously impacted cultural fire use, because the important thing about that is the knowledge was based on this long-term relationship with the land, like constantly going out, looking at factors in the environment, putting fire on the land, seeing what happened. And it was a high stakes thing too, right? Like if you went out and burned all the forest around you, that would be like a life and death situation, right? Like pre-colonization. So I think that, the stories are that people were much more careful with fire and much more knowledgeable about when it should be used properly. I think when we look at, the fire exclusion campaigns that happen, and then also combining them with fire suppression, what we've done is we've taken that, the natural law of fire out of the land. So lightning caused fires, human caused fires. And what that's kind of done is produce these, landscapes that aren't as well adapted to fire anymore. So one of the goals of Indigenous fire practices was to produce mosaics on the landscape so that people could go out and have different types of forests like around their communities. So, they could have meadows there where they'd harvest certain plants from. They'd have early succession forests where they had, younger deciduous trees and other things that maybe the moose and stuff would come in to browse to make hunting easier. They would grow berries around their community so that, that would also, they could hunt or harvest berries, but then they could also hunt bears that were attracted to those berries. And then old growth forests were important too, right? So it was having that mosaic. And now when we look at our forests, we don't have that mosaic anymore in many places. And also through like current forest management practices, we kind of get these monoculture forests, like, where we get replant, like where we're doing clear cutting, then replanting trees. And so it really has been impacting the health of the landscape to be able to sustain and carry good fire.
What strategies can be employed to integrate Indigenous fire knowledge into modern firefighting practices, and could such a collaboration enhance fire management outcomes?
So I think like technically, yes. Like obviously if we're using fire on the landscape during lower risk times, then there's less available to burn during high risk times. And combined with climate change, like I think that that's important, right? Where we're kind of trying to remove the availability of things to burn so that Indigenous people can have a healthy landscape to practice their cultures on. I think the risk with the term integration is that a lot of Indigenous knowledge has been appropriated by colonial institutions like the federal government. And so I think many people are concerned that, if they share these practices, then what it's going to become is that it won't affect their ability or their autonomy or sovereignty to carry out these practices on the landscape. It'll instead become something that like government does for them, kind of furthering that paternalistic relationship. So I think the movements I'm really seeing are for, Indigenous leadership in this space. So by looking at how we can reduce the barriers where Indigenous people are the ones who are actively putting fire and making decisions about fire management on their territories. And that would include the use of cultural fire. In Canada, it's important to recognize that many Indigenous people went from being fire lighters on the landscape to suddenly becoming firefighters, where they were then either employed or forced to go and put fire out on the landscape by the government. And so right now in Canada, we have a contingent basically of Indigenous firefighters who are incredibly knowledgeable at firefighting as well. And I mean, the one community that I did my PhD was Peavine Métis settlement. About 95% of the men that were between the ages of like 35 and 55 were firefighters. They had that experience. And so I think that that's something that we don't often recognize, is that those Indigenous people might not be certified as firefighters, but that they come from a vast experience of both cultural fire and like Western styles of firefighting.
Amy, thanks once again for joining me. Now we'll turn to Robert W. Gray, AFE certified wildland fire ecologist and president of R.W. Gray Consulting Limited. Robert, nice to meet you and thanks for coming on the program. Now, you have said in previous interviews that Canada needs to be on a quote unquote war footing to fight increasing instances of wildfires. What does this look like to you?
Yeah, so I'm a student of history, and so we think about this in the sense of an existential crisis. God, climate change and wildfires. They're of that scale, and they're going to continue to be at the scale, and even worse. I mean, some of the research suggests that fire seasons like this will be actually 2 to 3 times worse within the next 30 to 50 years. So when you're faced with an existential crisis, you have to basically look at all options. And the last time we were in this boat was when we faced fascism, the fascism threat in the 1930s and 1940s. At that time, the solution was you harnessed all of the power of industry, academia, public sector, industry, and to produce the war materials that we needed to solve that crisis. You sort of nationalized industries, and government had a direct role in the economy, and they picked winners and losers. Well, we're in somewhat of the same boat now. The basic problem is we have way too much biomass on the landscape. We have billions of tons of this material. In a lot of cases, it doesn't have much value. Small diameter trees, dense thickets of trees, lots of dead wood, diseased wood. It's in the billions of tons. So we have to find some way to do something with it before it burns up. And that means we have to look at the manufacturing sector and the service sector, and we have to look for markets of this stuff. Well, currently the approach is we'll let industry be the innovator and they'll find a solution. Well, the problem is they can't. We've got some sort of minimal levels of chipping going on for hog fuel and wood pellets here and there, but nowhere near the scale that we need. So this requires a government intervention. They're going to have to get in there and displace certain industries. So we can displace fossil fuels with bioenergy components. We can displace building materials with stuff that comes out of engineered wood products and things like that. So that's what I mean by the war footing. It's hearkening back to something that we did in the past, and it worked. At that time, we did it until 1945, 1946, and we were good to go. This time, there is no short-term solution. This is going to take decades and generations to solve this problem.
From your perspective, what are some practical ways we can start building resilience and start developing more proactive mitigation strategies as we face an increase in the severity and frequency of wildfires?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm part of a team. It's a project managed through the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, and it's a wildfire carbon project, and involves scientists from Canada and the US, both federal governments, academia. And we are looking at how do we reduce the area burned at high severity. We don't want to reduce all fires because fire is still good. We don't want high severity fires because all of those negative consequences are associated with that. So high GHG emissions, high particulate, very expensive fire seasons, damage to natural resources, all those things. So one of the ways we do that is we look to how fire wants to basically move through a landscape. And if you model these landscapes through simulation and you just drop all kinds of fires, and you run it for multiple decades or centuries, they will soon emerge a pattern to how fire wants to move. And we sort of describe those as corridors. Fire wants to move through certain corridors, and it's going to repeat burn some places more than others. Well, one of the ways that we reduce the area burned at high severity is we put fences in the way. And there's natural fences out there, reservoirs, lakes, rivers, rock and ice. But our historic landscapes had a lot of vegetative fences, recently burned areas, recently double burned areas, aspen stands, healthier riparian zones and meadows. All of those things broke up fire flow on the landscape. So to build back in resilience and resistance, we have to start to copy that pattern of a mosaic of vegetative communities and structures on the landscape that either slow fire or stop fire. And current modeling estimates suggest that about 40% of our landscapes needs to be in this different mosaic, and it's a more heterogeneous pattern than our current situation, which is it's just a homogeneous pattern of fuels from one end of the landscape to the next. And fire is a contagion, and we present it with this plentiful host, and it's going to take advantage of it. So we have to establish these patterns that we know worked in the past, and we suspect they'll work quite well in the future.
Given your involvement with international entities like the World Bank and your understanding of fire management policy, I'm wondering how you view the global response to wildfire challenges and if there's any lessons that can be applied to the current situation in Canada.
Sure. Globally, we're still focused too much on the response and recovery side. So the UN Disaster Program released some statistics not that long ago, and about 87% of disaster funding goes into response and recovery. So that's that initial attack and long-term attack and suppression side of things. And only 13% is going into mitigation. So that's the upfront, trying to solve the problem before it happens type of thing. And I don't know what our specific numbers are here in Canada, but we definitely fit that pattern. And we do need to shift this focus. So FEMA has mentioned that, the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction at Western, they've recently released some statistics too, suggesting that's the direction we have to go in. Some places that are doing it well, so Australia, especially in Western Australia, Northern Australia, where Aboriginal people basically do a lot of cultural burning, and they've started to see a shrink in fire size over time. The U.S. is starting to spend a lot more money. They're creating, legislative ability to do that. Here in Canada, we're still lagging fairly behind. We haven't really stated that that's our objective, is to really start to shrink fire size and shift this focus. Just recently, the forest minister did admit, when he was questioned by a reporter, that, yeah, we're probably spending too much money on suppression, not enough on prevention. So it's starting to sink in and become a bit more well-known, but we still have to make the shift.
Well, Robert, thanks so much. One last question for you. While conducting my research for this episode, I came across a tweet of yours that really struck me, and I'm hoping we can discuss it briefly. You tweeted, and I quote, "There is an opinion floating around that climate change will generate fire behavior that will render all of our efforts mute. It's just that, an opinion, not grounded in science." Can you elaborate on this sentiment?
Yeah, it really is a coupled, extreme fire behavior is a combination of fuels and weather. And if you have extreme fire seasons, then climate change kicks in. So there was a recent study where, they attributed this fire season across Canada to definitely having a link with climate change. So climate change affects things like longer fire season and more lightning throughout a fire season. And, the daytime, the diurnal, influence is no longer there, where fires can burn 24 hours. But you still have to have fuel. I mean, you can create hot, dry, windy conditions, but if you don't have fuel, you don't have extreme fire behavior. So they really are coupled. So to say that it's just climate change, first of all, it's not factually correct. Physics still does have a say in this. But the second part is we're dealing with massive social anxiety when it comes to this issue. And to suggest it's all climate change suggests there's nothing we can do about it. And politically, that's something that politicians who are loath to make investments in prevention and mitigation look at and go, well, why would we spend the money? Because we're not going to be successful anyway. And this renowned person has said that. So no, we can still turn this thing around. The door's not closed. It's closing, and we don't have forever to turn it around. But if we deal with the fuels, we can certainly have a big impact on the severity of fires in the end. Certainly, there's been a lot of discussion this year about, should we develop a NORAD style, U.S. Canadian firefighting apparatus or create this new national firefighting force? And do we have enough capacity as far as, number of firefighters out there? And there's definitely issues around, would that work? Whenever I was asked the question, my focus was, well, you need a workforce that can do that upfront mitigation work in the spring. And then when summer comes and fire season comes, you can certainly jump on increased capacity for suppression and response. And then once the fire season's over, you're right back to doing fuels work. So yeah, increasing capacity is a great idea, but it needs to be this holistic approach where it's basically tackling wildland fire from fuels through suppression. Attracting people to this is becoming problematic. All of the firefighting agencies at the provincial level are really struggling with recruitment and retention. So we really need to solve that problem, and talking to people who have left is find, okay, so why did you leave this profession, and how do we keep people engaged in it? Because we're going to need capacity to do this job.
Robert, thanks so much. Up next, Dr. Mike Flanagan, BC Innovation Research Chair in Fire Science at the University of Alberta. Mike, nice to meet you, and thanks for coming on the program. To kick things off, what specific climate conditions and changes have led to the record-setting year of wildfires in Canada and globally, and how have these conditions deviated from historical patterns, and what role does climate change play in this divergence?
You need 3 ingredients for a wildfire to occur, and the first thing is vegetation. Fire people call it fuel. What type? How much? How dry? All aspects of fuel. Second, you need ignition. Human and their activities, and lightning. And third, hot, dry, windy weather. You have all 3, you have a wildfire. Fire is driven by extremes. In Canada, 3% of the fires burn 97% of the area burned. Western United States is 1% of the fires burn 99% of the area burned. And much of this happens on a relatively small number of days of hot, dry, windy conditions. We call them spread days because these are the days that fire is actively spread. So what's going on? Well, we're seeing warmer and drier, or hotter and drier conditions in many regions of the world. And this may be because of the jet stream, and we can talk about that later, why the jet stream is playing a role. But right now we're seeing hotter and drier. And this is part of a trend that, the world is getting hotter, and in places drier. Other places it's wetter, and we're seeing floods and excessive floods in cases. So this is part of the recipe, is this warmer, drier conditions are a real issue. Now, what we're finding in our research, and we've been studying fires and climate change for over 30 years, and we're finding a warmer world translates into more fires. And people say, well, why is temperature so important? And here I'm not talking about an individual fire like the Lytton fire, where wind becomes a critical agent, or Fort McMurray. I'm talking about fire over a large area, like a province, like British Columbia, for a longer period of time, decades. So 3 reasons. Fire people seem to love 3s for some reason. But anyway, the warmer it is, the longer our fire seasons are. And we're seeing that throughout much of Canada. Our fire seasons are already a week or 2 longer than they used to be. And 2023 in particular started off with a bang. It started early with record-breaking heat. Second, the warmer it is, the more lightning we see. Now in Canada, about 50% of fires are started by people and their activities, and 50% by lightning. But lightning is responsible for about 90% of the area burned. So, we've seen a doubling of area burned in Canada since the 1970s. And my colleagues and I attribute this largely, not solely, to human-caused climate change. But human-caused fires, numbers have been going down. Area burned associated with human-caused fires have been going down. Things like education, fire bans seem to be doing their job. But lightning-caused fires have more than compensated for that because of the increase in fire activity we're seeing. So more lightning means more fire. And the third reason, probably the most important, probably the most convoluted, as the air temperature increases, the ability to suck moisture out of the fuel, and here I'm talking about forest fuels on the forest floor, cured grass, needles, leaves, it responds very quickly to the atmosphere. So this ability to dry them out increases exponentially with temperature. So unless we see more rain to compensate for this drying effect from the warming, we end up with drier fuels. And this is a critical aspect of understanding fire, because the drier the fuel, easier it is for a fire to start, easier it is for a fire to spread, and it means more fuel is available to burn, which leads to higher intensity fires that are difficult to impossible to extinguish. So a warmer world means more fire and unfortunately more smoke as well. And smoke can travel thousands of kilometers. You can be downtown Toronto, downtown New York, and the likelihood of your place burning down to a wildland fire is essentially zero. However, your life can be miserable for weeks because of wildland fire smoke from a fire 1,000 kilometers away. So it can impact many people like it did in 2023 on the Eastern Seaboard. Millions of people were impacted significantly by fires 1,000 kilometers away.
Can we anticipate further increases in wildfire intensity and frequency due to climate change? And if so, from your perspective, how do we mitigate this or address this?
Yes, for Canada and the United States and for other regions of the world, we can expect warmer conditions, more extreme weather, and these will lead to more fire activity and unfortunately more consequences because, you know, as we see larger fires, more intense fires, it will bump into societal values, whether it's critical infrastructure or unfortunately communities. And we'll see more and more of this. In addition, there's more development on the landscape. There's more homes being built. There's more industry. And so a fire doesn't have to get very big before it bumps or intersects with society. So yes, we expect more in the future. Now, the second part was about, you know, what can we do? Well, there's a couple things we can do, okay? First, you know, a lot of what we're seeing in terms of increases is due to human-caused climate change. So the sooner we get our act together as a global society, from individuals to municipalities, to provincial and state governments, to federal governments and industry working together to reduce greenhouse gases. So that will help. But to be more specific about fire, let's work with the three ingredients. Day-to-day weather, we really can't do much about. We will see hot, dry, windy conditions. And unfortunately, it looks like we're going to see hotter and drier and more of them in the future. Second, lightning. You know, we can't do much about lightning either. Human-caused fires, we can do things. And as I mentioned, our track record is pretty good, but we can do better because every human-caused fire is preventable. So fire bans we use, forest closures, we don't use effectively or enough. Forest closures where there's no recreational activity, no industrial activity allowed in the forest. Very effective at stopping human-caused ignitions. And they have been used in places. California used them last year, Nova Scotia and Alberta used them this year, but unfortunately, they used them after we had fire emergency across the province. You have to use them before things happen. And I can give you an example from British Columbia. I live in Kamloops, British Columbia. Last week was a very fire-filled week. And the city of Kamloops said, we're closing our natural walking trails because the fire risk is too high and we don't need any more fires in the landscape. So kudos to them for doing that kind of activity, but it should be done at a larger scale. And how we fight fires, you know, we seem to be reactive rather than preemptive. And we should be moving quickly. So what typically happens is within a province or jurisdiction, fire management's very good at moving resources around. And I'll use Alberta example here. So fire danger is high in Fort McMurray. They move extra resources to the Fort McMurray region, and that's great. But what happens if the situation overwhelms a province? They call CIFC, Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Center, and they say, we need additional resources. Places like Quebec or Nova Scotia say, yeah, we can send resources. But when they make the phone call, it's after the fire situation has already erupted. And it takes 3 days for that firefighter or helicopter to come from Quebec to get to the fire line. That's 3 days too late. We have seen multiple occasions this fire season where we saw the fire weather forecast a week in advance saying, look out, hot, dry, windy weather, extreme conditions are coming. That's when you make the call and get additional resources. And, I propose even a national team of firefighters to be quick deployed in advance of the extreme weather. Now, people say it's expensive. Okay, yes, it is expensive. But for every dollar you spend on prevention, it usually saves you $5 to $15 down the road. And by preventing disasters like Fort McMurray and Lytton. So other people say sometimes the weather forecast is wrong. Right again. But if it's right more often than not, it more than pays for itself. Other people say it's a provincial responsibility and not a federal responsibility. And they're right. The federal government, if they create something like a FEMA for fires, earthquakes, floods, would have to work hand in glove with the provinces. But it is a concern and a responsibility of the federal government because health and safety is a responsibility of the federal government. And here we're talking about preventing disasters. And it actually saves you money by preventing the disaster rather than paying out for the disaster. So I see it as a way forward.
Our last guest of today's program will be Dr. Jill Harvey, Canada Research Chair in Fire Ecology at Thompson Rivers University. Dr. Harvey, it's nice to meet you and thanks for making time to chat today. Why don't we dive right in? To kick off the discussion, I'm wondering if you can touch on in what ways decades of fire suppression and forest management practices has influenced the flammability of forests.
Yeah, so in some areas of British Columbia, we've managed forests for timber and wood product resources in ways that require large areas of even-aged forests. And this, together with the buildup of forest fuels over the past 100 years of fire suppression, really has created a blanket of continuous fuels over the landscape in some areas. Now, without heterogeneity in forests and also in natural areas, which really equates to the fuel when we're thinking about the wildfire equation, when a wildfire starts and weather conditions promote its spread, this continuous blanket of fuel can result in really large wildfires. So already in British Columbia, some wildfires are permitted to burn and even augmented in certain cases. But this decision to not suppress a wildfire is made carefully and with consideration of communities, also areas of cultural significance, and a cautious eye to weather and the entire fire season as a whole. So permitting more fires to burn when it's safe to do so could be an approach that we could consider. But this would absolutely require building up training and resources to manage these cases. Now, further, we need to also look at our forests and natural areas from high up. Imagine you're an eagle flying overhead. Think about the broader landscape and how we can build heterogeneity, how we can build more patchiness back into the landscapes from a forest management perspective. So this would really improve the resilience of these areas to future large wildfires. And we can do this by coordinating forest management and by managing for many values that we place on forest ecosystems. But we also have to invest in longer-term operational projects and research. In BC, there really is an urgency to do this. We can just look to the Donny Creek wildfire, the largest wildfire in BC history, covering just under 6,000 square kilometers the last time I checked. Large wildfires like this will occur again in the future. But it's very important to note that it's not just one thing that's driving extreme wildfire behavior. We can't just say it's forest management. It's a combination of factors, including weather, climate change, a legacy of effective fire suppression, and also the past criminalization of traditional indigenous burning practices.
Can you elaborate upon how forest management practices can be shifted to encourage more proactive measures as opposed to reactive responses once wildfires are already underway?
Yeah, this is a good question. Most of the resources allocated to wildfire are placed in reactive fire responses, like fire suppression. And the work that provincial agencies do in Canada to fight wildfires near our communities and values is really crucial and important. I can't underscore that enough. But we need to look towards and invest in some longer-term strategies. This is really about making a plan for us to coexist with wildfire. Wildfire will play a more and more central role to our lives here in British Columbia, whether it's through the direct impacts of the fires themselves and other impacts that relate to smoke, or more indirectly through impacts on travel and also the resources that we use. We also can't minimize the effects that wildfires have on mental health, whether you're maybe fleeing on an evacuation order or watching a fellow Canadian's home burning on TV. So a plan is needed. We need a plan to coexist with wildfire. And this really begins with acceptance of the relationship between climate change and wildfire. As the climate warms and dries, wildfire activity increases. This is proven in the scientific literature. These long-term plans need to include practices like thinning forests, reducing fuel, and the regular use of prescribed and cultural fire. We can consider maybe applying a framework to implement these practices at the landscape scale. Again, it's about building and improving the diversity and the heterogeneity of our natural landscapes. We also have to remember that diversity underpins excellence, and thus our plans, they need to include a diverse range of people, skill sets, and also perspectives. Forests are so important for so many reasons to different people, and protecting this resource across these values will require exceptional coordination. We also have to remember that for about every $1 to $2 spent in prevention, we can save about $5 in reactive management resource measures. So we need to spend upfront in order for us to save in the future. We can also support and promote indigenous-led land and wildfire stewardship. Generations of fire stewardship really lie with the Indigenous people of Canada, and we can really learn from this.
The 2023 wildfire season in Canada has already surpassed records set in previous years, partly attributed to a combination of hot, dry conditions and the resulting ignition of fires. Could you elaborate on the interplay between these factors, especially in relation to their connection to climate change, and how do these conditions amplify the likelihood of wildfires?
Yeah, 2023 has been a hard year for Canadians to coexist with wildfire. News reporting with words and phrases like record-setting, extreme, largest ever have described wildfires not just in BC and the Northwest Territories, but really across the country to Quebec and even Halifax. Climate change is really driving these observed increases in wildfire. Fire seasons, they're starting earlier and they're extending later into the fall. Warmer springs promote the drying of fuels, which then in turn increases their flammability throughout the fire season. So then increased flammability promotes the ignition and also the spread of wildfires. So you can see the connections here. The combination of dry fuels with extreme weather conditions synergizes to support explosive wildfires. But weather is a key factor in the ingredients for these big wildfires. Heat domes, like we experienced in 2021, and also this year in 2023, those heat domes preceded the wildfires that burned down Lytton in 2021 and the wildfires that are still burning near West Kelowna, the Shuswap region, and Kelowna. And these heat domes are really, they're days and weeks of prolonged extreme heat and not a lot of precipitation. And they precondition the forest to burn by drying the fuels. Then you add an ignition, a lightning strike, and the fire begins. That's how it all starts. And then if dry and windy conditions persist or they escalate, like they did recently when we had an incoming cold front, we are left with a really dangerous situation to contend with. These wildfires, they can move really quickly. They can spot large distances ahead of the active fire front. And if they occur close to communities, they can really have devastating effects. So will we see an increase in the fire season going forward? Yes. Will we also see more heat dome events, potentially more lightning, and thus more extreme wildfire behavior? Yeah. Have forest management practices contributed to extreme fires? In some cases, yes, but not all. But there are actions that we can take to improve our ability to coexist with wildfire. We can try to mitigate the effects of these big wildfire years. We really need to think long-term, and we need to think proactive, and ultimately we really need to think together.
Dr. Harvey, thanks so much. Before we go, do you have any final thoughts to share for our audience?
Yeah, sure. So if I have a couple minutes, I'll just take you on a little trip to the Churn Creek Protected Area, which is in central interior BC. And this area is a special area, but it contains the largest tracts of native grasslands we have in British Columbia. And in 2017, I completed a project in this area that documents wildfire activity for 400 years. And from 1600 to 1896, which is about 300 years, wildfires occurred every 15 to 25 years. And these frequent wildfires reduced forest fuels and maintained an open forest structure. So in 2017, I sampled this one tree, and a tree that survived wildfires, and it left a mark from each fire, and it's recorded in the growth rings of the tree. And when I sampled the tree in 2017, it's located in a closed, dense forest. But remember, this tree is recording multiple wildfires, 14 wildfires over 300 years, but then no fires since 1896. A real absence of wildfire here is documented for the last 100 years. And then this past summer, in June 2023, I revisited this tree. And there's nothing remaining except a charred stump on this really blackened moonscape. So what happened? Well, in 2021, just a few years ago, wildfire came into Churn Creek, and supported by this dense, continuous forest and dry, windy conditions, a high-intensity wildfire burned that left severe ecological effects. And this is really a great example of this legacy of fire suppression and also the criminalization of Indigenous fire stewardship that went on since time immemorial at this site. A forest that was once resilient to wildfire, insect outbreaks, now burned at high intensity with severe ecological effects. And this is just one tree, but this study actually included 90 of these trees, all simultaneously recording the same thing, which feeds into a larger body of research that really documents the effects of fire suppression over the last 100 years and a change and a transition in fire regimes in the central part of British Columbia. So, and then I'd just also like to say that, you know, Indigenous fire stewardship is not my area of expertise, but every landscape that I conduct research in was managed to an extent with cultural fire. And an intimate knowledge of when and where to use fire to manage habitat, also desired plant species, and reduce risk to communities by relieving the landscape of fuel. We need to learn from this knowledge, and we also need to support Indigenous people and their right to burn.
That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or you can subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next time.